The dogmatic theology can be distinguished from scriptural exegesis, moral theology, historical theology, or from speculative theology. The term was used in the 17th century for a less speculative theology, Catholic theology, one more closely tied throughout its content to expressing the dogmatic teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. It sought to escape what seemed to be endless speculative disagreements between Dominicans and Jesuits, for the firm safety of what was definitely taught by the Church on any subject. Needless to say, any reining in of speculation it achieved in theology did not last. But this dogmatic theology was more influential in promoting church doctrine rather than, say, scripture as the immediate starting point for theological work. A theologian then began his work by looking into what the church taught. Today I'm going to look at what the church teaches about human origins. This is not, however, because I agree that the theologian must begin his work by inspecting church teaching. The 20th century saw a return in Catholic theology to the idea that scripture and tradition are theology's immediate starting point. However, this task is properly undertaken in communion with the Church's teaching authority or magisterium, namely the Pope and bishops, so that in interpreting scripture and tradition, the theologian takes advantage of the guidance that the magisterium has to offer. So what I'm going to attempt today is not how a theologian begins to reflect on questions of human origins, nor all of such reflection from beginning to end. But this paper represents one act of theology that must take place within any wider attempt to seek theological understanding that is to count as genuinely Catholic. Given then that we have this dogmatic contribution to the wider theological task, how can we further specify the contribution it makes? The answer comes from another aspect of dogmatic theology, one much used from the 17th century onwards and of enduring influence in all subsequent scholastic theology. This is the practice of attaching theological notes to doctrines and theological opinions, notes which specify the places of those doctrines and opinions within a scheme running all the way from matters divinely revealed to faith, all the way down to something like opinions that the Church tolerates. This practice gave great clarity to theologians' understanding of what was non-negotiable for Catholic theology and what could be legitimately debated among theologians. I should draw your attention to the fact that not every theologian used the same list of notes, and different theologians could assign different notes to the same proposition. For example, when I researched my book on Christ's possession of the beatific vision during his earthly lifetime, I found that some theologians have thought it de fide, a matter of faith, while others said that it was proximate or near to faith, and others still that it was a theological certainty, but not a matter of faith. In some questions, one can draw more clarity from the fact that the magisterium has spoken on some issue, making its theological note easier to specify. Moreover, the clarification in the 19th century of different levels of teaching authority, from extraordinary infallible definitions of faith by a pope or ecumenical council, down to the ordinary everyday magisterium of popes, local councils and local bishops, their ordinary magisterium itself covering a wide range of teaching authority down to purely disciplinary acts, has helped the theologian place propositions with the correct note. Sometimes the exercise of the extraordinary magisterium has meant a change of note for many theologians. Until the infallible definition of Our Lady's Immaculate Conception in 1854, theologians generally gave her Immaculate Conception the note of proximate to faith or theologically certain or something like that. Not that the magisterium has set out to teach in a systematic and comprehensive way which propositions have which notes, or indeed promulgate a definitive list of notes. The work of the magisterium tends to be a more pastoral response to particular questions that arise. Hence, in determining the note of any particular teaching, an act of dogmatic theology has to make use not only of magisterial statements, but of the broader corpus of the work of other theologians. And so it is in this more specific way that an act of dogmatic theology contributes to the wider theological movement of seeking understanding of the content of Scripture and tradition. Today I'm going to apply this to certain questions of human origins. The Catholic theologian begins, as I've said, with the texts of Holy Scripture, reading in particular the early chapters of Genesis in the light especially of the New Testament. Genesis 2 presents Adam's body as moulded by God from the dust of the earth, and Eve as made by God from one of Adam's ribs. The biblical narrative further presents this single couple as the beginning of the human race as a whole. They enjoy a certain intimacy with God and their surroundings, including access to the tree of life, which is denied them after they sinned. In Romans 5, Paul speaks of the origin and spread of sin and death as stemming from Adam. What light dogmatic theology throws on the biblical text is the more urgent in the case of human origins, on account of the fact that modern science appears to tell a different story. Human origins are explained in terms of the theory of evolution, where the biological species or subspecies to which we belong, Homo sapiens, takes its origin from within a wider biological classing of human species or subspecies, of which Homo sapiens is the only living example today. This wider biological species or class of different humans itself derives over all from within a wider biological classing of hominids, and they were in primates and so on. Whether we think of Homo sapiens only, or humans more broadly, human beings have their origin from other living hominids. In terms of number, population genetics thinks not in terms of an original couple in any of these cases of species or subspecies, but of a particular population that becomes relatively isolated on its own distinct evolutionary pathway. Although there are debates about what exactly constitutes a biological species, I think it is fair to say that over many generations, such a particular population emerges as a distinct species insofar as it no longer breeds with those other populations to whom it is most closely related. In terms of number, as far as Homo sapiens is concerned, we are speaking of a breeding population of some thousands. Finally, there is no evidence from science of any kind of primeval golden age, whether we locate that at the origin of the first human species, at the origin of Homo sapiens, or of any other human species or subspecies. Neither is there in any of these cases evidence of anything other than human mortality. I shall begin by asking about the highest level of magisterial teaching for which the Church claims infallibility. According to Catholic teaching, it is the gift of infallibility to the Church that enables what has been revealed by God to faith to be reliably passed on in the Church. And this takes place partly by informing the Church's teaching on matters of faith and matters closely bound up with faith. When something is taught infallibly, it is taught definitively, and so is not open to be changed. It may be further clarified and developed and balanced by some other teaching, but it cannot be exchanged by the magisterium for some altogether different teaching. This gift of infallibility is something at work all the time in the day-to-day transmission of Catholic teaching, but it is found in a particular way in definitions that are made by popes or ecumenical councils. I gave an example earlier of the definition of the Immaculate Conception by Pope Pius IX. The only infallible definitions that I can find that have relevance to the questions I have raised about human origins are from the Council of Trent, which responded in the 16th century to the Protestant reformers. Part of what was at issue were the doctrines of grace and original sin. Its decree on original sin was promulgated in 1546. The Council took great care to avoid all the details of what it regarded as legitimate debate among Catholic theologians on original sin, and restricted its decree to where it felt it had to put clear water between Catholic teaching and heresy. It also took care to say that it was not the Council's intention to include the Blessed and Immaculate Virgin Mary in what it had to say about original sin. As you will recall, the doctrine that Mary did not inherit original sin was not defined until 1854. Now, in approaching original sin, Trent made use of the traditional approach of condemning or anathematizing the position considered contrary to the faith in the canons. It also made use of canons passed by local councils from the early Church against the heresy of Pelagianism, and integrated them into its own teaching, thus distinguishing Catholic teaching from both Pelagianism and Protestantism. And so we have the following anti-Pelagian canon. If anyone does not profess that Adam, the first human being, by transgressing God's commandment in paradise, at once lost the holiness and justice in which he had been constituted, and that offending God by his sin, he drew upon himself death, and that the whole Adam, body and soul, was changed for the worse through the offence of his sin. That's a quote from the 6th century Second Council of Orange. Let him be anathema. So what does the anathema mean for the extraordinary magisterium's teaching on human origins? It seems to me that the Council defined that humanity was initially constituted in holiness and justice, and it is implied here that there was for this humanity no death, and a better state in body and soul was had than that which later came through sin. It seems to me that, in interpreting the biblical narrative, a Catholic theologian is thus committed to a real state of original justice at the beginning of human history, which was then lost through sin. But if this is the case, what potential is there for this position being contradicted by the findings of natural science? Very little, it seems to me, so long as original justice, with its gift of immortality, is not something that in principle falls within the scope of natural science. I suggest that dogmatic theology guides the theologian here through the Magisterium's teaching that original justice is a state higher than nature, and so to which natural science as such has no access. In support of this, I shall turn again to the 16th century, this time to the condemnation of Michael Bartius by the Dominican Pope St. Pius V in his bull of 1567, Ex Omnibus Afflictionibus. Bartius was a Flemish theologian at the University of Louvain, who had been present at Trent from 1563 to represent his university. Concerning grace, Bartius taught that the raising up of human nature and its elevation to participation in the divine nature was owed to the integrity of man in his first state, and is therefore to be called natural, not supernatural. The implication that grace was owed to human nature, and not a gratuitous gift to humanity, but part of human nature, would cause Bartius trouble. In the same vein, he also taught that the state of original justice was not a gratuitous exaltation of human nature, but its natural condition. The implication is that the immortality enjoyed initially by humanity came to it naturally, rather than from some gift exalting humanity above its natural limits. It is not clear which of 76 propositions in total Pius V condemned, which he intended to condemn as heretical, since he intended to condemn only some as heretical, others as erroneous, others as suspect, others as temerarious, and others as offensive to pious ears. And so dogmatic theology does not regard their condemnation as defining any matter of faith, as was the case with Trent. However, by condemning these views, Pius V nevertheless taught that original justice was instead a state that elevated humanity beyond the limits of human nature, affirming that immortality and so on were more or less supernatural or preternatural rather than natural. Before I go any further and draw some implications of all this for the question of human origins, I should draw your attention to the fact that Bartius and those who followed him could point to the local anti-Pelagian Council of Carthage of 418 in favour of their position that immortality was at first natural to human beings. Interpreting Genesis 3, this council had declared that whoever says that Adam, the first human being, was made mortal in the sense that he was to die a bodily death whether he sinned or not, which means that to quit the body would not be a punishment for sin, but a necessity of nature, let him be anathema. In other words, Carthage taught that human mortality was a punishment for sin and not a necessity of nature, implying that humanity was originally immortal by nature. But this seems to involve a contradiction within the teaching of the Magisterium, which would be troubling, or at the very least, there would be a change in magisterial teaching. Carthage would have taught that immortality was natural to humanity, whereas Pius V would have had it as above nature, preternatural. Trent had probably been aware of the issue because it did not repeat that canon in its decree. The apparent contradiction is, however, easily resolved historically when one takes into account the way that nature was used in a slightly different way in theology after the reception of Aristotelian ideas of nature by theologians in the 13th century, with their analysis of the inclinations and powers of human nature, along with the development of the Christian idea of the supernatural in contrast to nature. Before that reception, human nature was used by St. Augustine and others to indicate the whole state of humanity before the fall, without anything comparable to an analysis of nature inspired by Aristotle. This is clear enough from context. From the 13th century, theologians like Aquinas distinguished within Augustine's account of original humanity between human nature as such and a further supernatural endowment of original justice, immortality, and so on. Aquinas held that by nature human beings are mortal, but in the state of original justice, the supernatural gift of immortality meant that the first human beings were immortal. Once we take into account that Carthage was working with Augustine's use of natural, and Pius V was working with Aquinas' use of natural, we can see that Carthage and Pope Pius don't really contradict each other. Immortality was in fact natural insofar as it was part of the original state of humanity, but was not itself derived from human nature, technically speaking, but was a supernatural gift to nature. This is not the only example where the Magisterium uses the same words at different times in different ways, and it illustrates the importance of a historical approach in the interpretation of magisterial statements. It seems to me that the distinction between natural and supernatural, originally employed in the medieval theology of grace and used to exclude the views of Barthius, becomes relevant in a new way when we ask about where there is potential for conflict between faith and science concerning human origins. Given that original justice, including the gift of immortality, is something supernatural, it is not something open to investigation by the natural sciences. That a human being has enjoyed such a gift is not something that is going to show up in the archaeological or genetic record. That I or anyone else has received the supernatural grace of baptism is not going to be found directly in the examination of any human body, dead or alive. And the same goes for any supernatural gift of immortality once lost. It is not going to show up in the archaeological or biological record. And in any case, no theologian has ever supposed that the state of original justice lasted long enough to produce artifacts indicative of some golden age. At most, the state of original justice is traditionally thought to have lasted no more than a couple of hours. But if there is no potential for conflict between the natural sciences and faith in the area of the supernatural, at the same time this identifies the natural as the site of any possible conflict. Turning then to the natural, I return to the extraordinary magisterium of the Council of Trent. If there is nothing infallibly defined by Trent in regard to the supernatural that will give us theological cause for concern, what about the natural? For example, what, if anything, did Trent define about the historical existence of Adam, whom Trent's canon on original justice referred to as the first human being, in line with the canons of earlier local councils? It seems to me that nothing was in fact infallibly taught by Trent about the question of the historical existence of the first human being, or about the number of the original human population. My reasons for this are at base historical. We've already seen how theologians interpret magisterial statements with the aid of their historical context. Likewise, it is standard practice for theologians to determine precisely what is condemned in an anathema by asking against whom the anathema was historically aimed. when we look into the Pelagianism and Protestantism against which Trent took its aim, we can find no one who denied the historical existence of Adam or descent of the human race from a first couple. Hence we can conclude that Trent's anathema does not define against any such position, and that Trent defined nothing as such about the first human beings beyond the content of the canon on the state of original justice, and nothing about how many first human beings there were or their natural origin. This conclusion is supported by the fact that the theologians who prepared the original documents for Vatican I, the Ecumenical Council which took place from 1869 to 1870, put into their first draft of a document on the Catholic faith what is clearly meant to be an infallible definition on the common descent of the whole human race from Adam and Eve. After a brief survey of Scripture, it concludes, "Whence under anathema we condemn the error by which this unity and common origin of the whole human race is denied." It seems to me that, had the theologians who drafted this schema thought that Trent had already defined the matter, they would not have proposed defining it here, but would have made reference to Trent's anathema. But they did not. Of course, their proposed definition did not take place because the content of the final document in general was much reduced. It seems to me then that the conclusion that Trent did not define such things is well established and not a recent invention to save the Church's extraordinary magisterium from embarrassment, as some people have supposed. But if such things are not found in the extraordinary magisterium, what about the Church's ordinary magisterium and her ordinary and universal magisterium? The ordinary and universal magisterium refers to the Pope and bishops united in teaching a matter of faith or something closely bound up with faith definitively, without an extraordinary act of definition. As you can imagine, determining what is being taught in this way is incredibly difficult for lack of documentary evidence. To be certain about it, you'd have to find out what they were all teaching and whether they were teaching it definitively or not. What is easier to do is to determine through documentary evidence if something falls under the non-infallible, non-definitive ordinary magisterium, and that's what I'm going to do. Here the most important document is Pope Pius XII's encyclical letter of 1950, Humani Generis. Back in 1941, when he had given a speech to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the Pope had mentioned that there were ongoing investigations about human origins in paleontology, biology, and morphology, by which he meant the study of species. He said that he would leave the question raised here to a future date, in which science would be guided and illumined by the content of divine revelation. Pius's own contribution to this question came in Humani Generis. Although the encyclical is largely concerned, according to its title, with some false opinions threatening to undermine the foundations of Catholic doctrine, it is more or less positive in its attitude to evolution, if cautious. I quote at length, "It remains for us now to speak about those questions which, although they pertain to the positive sciences, are nevertheless more or less connected with the truths of the Christian faith. In fact, not a few insistently demand that the Catholic religion take these sciences into account as much as possible. This certainly would be praiseworthy in the case of clearly proven facts. But caution must be used when there is rather a question of hypotheses having some sort of scientific foundation in which the doctrine contained in sacred scripture or in tradition is involved. If such conjectural opinions are directly or indirectly opposed to the doctrine revealed by God, then the demand that they be recognised can in no way be admitted. For these reasons, the Church's magisterium does not forbid that, in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology, research and discussions on the part of men experienced in both fields take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution, insofar as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent and living matter. For the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God. However, this must be done in such a way that the reasons for both opinions, that is, those favourable and those unfavourable to evolution, be weighed and judged with the necessary seriousness, moderation, and measure, and provided that all are prepared to submit to the judgment of the Church, to whom Christ has given the mission of authoritatively interpreting the sacred scriptures and of defending the dogmas of faith. Some, however, rashly transgress this liberty of discussion when they act as if the origin of the human body from pre-existing and living matter were already completely certain and proved by the facts which have been discovered up to now and by reasoning on those facts, and as if there were nothing in the sources of divine revelation which demands the greatest moderation and caution in this question. It's interesting to compare this cautious opening to evolution with St. John Paul II's words to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 1996, namely that the theory of evolution was then considered to be more than a hypothesis. I take this to mean that there were by then no remaining competitors within science, and that from this point of view, theology was dealing pretty much with evolution alone. One unsurprising point maintained by Pius, and confirmed by John Paul, was that the human soul could not be explained in evolutionary terms. In his speech of 1941, Pius had already remarked that it was the spiritual soul that made humanity the highest creature in the animal kingdom. But when Pius says in 1950 that the Catholic faith requires us to hold that human souls are immediately created by God, he does not mean that this is a matter of faith. Although various things had been defined concerning the soul by the extraordinary magisterium, such as Lateran 5 defining that each human being had his or her own individual soul, rather than everyone sharing a common one, the soul's origin had never been defined. Although the idea of souls pre-existing their bodies had fallen out of favour in the early church, there was still uncertainty as to whether one's soul was immediately created by God or was derived from the souls of one's parents, a theory known as traducianism. By Aquinas' time, immediate creation was the normal teaching, because it was thought not possible to reconcile traducianism with the immaterial simplicity of the soul. Immediate creation was thus the last theory standing, and so it came to be treated by theologians as theologically certain and entered into the Church's ordinary magisterium. Thus, when speaking of the Immaculate Conception in the 17th century, Pope Alexander VII spoke of the creation of Mary's soul. So it was hardly surprising that Pius XII should draw the conclusion that Adam's soul, since it too was immediately created by God, could not be explained by the material process of evolution. It seems to me that a further implication of the spiritual soul for the theological question of human origins is that this soul itself must enter into the definition of the human species, and that the theological definition of what counts as a true human being will differ thus from any biological definition of species by the material sciences. Not that these definitions will contradict one another, so long as the biological definition is recognised as extending only to the material bodily aspect of the human being. What Pius did allow was that Catholics were free to explain Adam's body in terms of evolution. Now, this exercise of the ordinary magisterium does appear to be at variance with what had come before, though not perhaps as much as one might think. It would certainly have been lawful in itself for the Pope to change a teaching of the ordinary magisterium. But is that what he did? At issue is the implication of the exercise of this freedom that the formation of Adam's body from dust and perhaps the derivation of Eve's body from Adam, as found in Genesis 2, would be treated figuratively rather than historically. Their literal meaning in this case now being what had formerly been treated as a spiritual allegorical meaning. The literal historical interpretation had certainly been almost universally held until its challenge by evolution. But what dogmatic authority did it actually have? A local provincial council of bishops at Cologne in 1860 had taught by their own ordinary magisterium that the first parents were made immediately by God. Therefore we declare as contrary to sacred scripture and to the faith the opinion of those who are not ashamed to assert that man, insofar as his body is concerned, came to be by a spontaneous change from imperfect nature to the most perfect, and in a continuous process finally became human. The fact that Pius IX gave recognition to the council did not raise this local condemnation to an infallible definition, because in canon law, such recognition meant not approbation of individual teachings, but a general recognition that everything had been carried out lawfully. This principle is clearly found in the canon law textbooks of the time. Thus, this condemnation of evolution, while being part of the local magisterium in Cologne, did not enter into the Pope's own magisterium. Moreover, the placing of a book about evolution on the Index of Forbidden Books in 1878 did not have much effect on any theological note. The Index didn't give specific reasons for why Catholics were forbidden to read any book. It could have been not for doctrinal reasons at all. So theologians didn't draw any doctrinal conclusions. Towards the end of the 19th century, theologians gave the special creation of Adam's body either the note of certain teaching or the note of common teaching. However, when a Jesuit journalist wrote in 1902 that the Holy Office had intervened in some cases of books on evolution, that gave the impression to theologians that the special creation of Adam's body was part of the ordinary magisterium of the Church, because of the high authority of the Holy Office, the forerunner of today's CDF, its role as an instrument of the Pope's Magisterium. Until the archives of the index were opened in 1997, it was unknown that in fact the Holy Office had nothing to do with these cases, but only the index. Hence, in the period before Humani Generis, the authority of the special creation of Adam's body was exaggerated, and it appeared that Pius XII was changing the ordinary magisterium on this point, but it seems to me that he wasn't. But after Humani Generis, evolution as well as special creation were legitimate explanations of the first human body. However, something had also been said by the Pontifical Biblical Commission about the bodies of Adam and Eve. In 1905, the Commission had allowed that where there were strong arguments for a particular case, one could say that the biblical author of a historical book might not have been writing history properly so called at some point, but writing in the form of history. However, in 1909, it also declared that there was no solid foundation for those theories that had proposed this for the first 3 chapters of Genesis. This declaration continued that it could not be taught that these chapters did not contain stories of events that really happened, and it could not be taught that they were fables devoid of a basis in objective reality, but setting forth philosophical or religious truths under the guise of history. Furthermore, a teacher must not call into question the literal historical sense of, among other things, the special creation of Adam and the formation of Eve from Adam. These were not doctrinal statements, but disciplinary measures for teachers of Scripture. They were effectively withdrawn by the Biblical Commission in 1948, which said that the historicity of the first 11 chapters of Genesis could not be affirmed or denied en bloc without unjustifiably applying to them the rules of some literary genre in which they could not actually be classified. Nevertheless, the decree said that there is history in some sense of the word in what is a popular description of the origins of the human race. Humani Generis said that this letter clearly points out that the first 11 chapters of Genesis, although properly speaking not conforming to the historical methods used by the best Greek and Latin writers, or by competent authors of our time, do nevertheless pertain to history in a true sense, which, however, must be further studied and determined by exegetes. In line with this, the ordinary magisterium in today's Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches that the early chapters of Genesis use a figurative language to tell us what happened at the beginnings of human history. This principle seems more or less to favour a figurative interpretation of the derivation of Adam and Eve's bodies. But since we're to hear about that next week, I'll say no more about it. Finally, in Humani Generis, the ordinary magisterium broached the question of how many first human beings there were. Both monogenism, where the human race is descended from a single couple, and polygenism, where the human race is descended from a larger original population. Pius wrote, "When, however, there is question of another conjectural opinion, namely polygenism, the children of the Church by no means enjoy such liberty." That is the liberty they enjoy in interpreting the origin of the first human body. For the faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true human beings who did not take their origin through natural generation from him as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. Now, it is in no way evident how such an opinion can be reconciled with that which the sources of revealed truth and the documents of the Church's magisterium propose with regard to original sin, which proceeds from a sin actually committed by an individual Adam, and which through generation is passed on to all and is in everyone as his own. Pius thus affirms monogenism as the ordinary teaching of the Church, and this was later reaffirmed by St. Paul VI at a theological symposium on original sin in 1966. I'm not going to read that out, but it's on the handout. However, it is true that this teaching has not been explicitly repeated by any magisterial document since 1966. Nevertheless, I would caution against supposing that it has been withdrawn. Christ's beatific vision was not explicitly taught by any magisterial document between 1943, when it appeared in Pius XII's encyclical Mystici Corporis Christi, and 2006, when it reappeared in a CDF notification. Likewise, I think we should suppose that monogenism could make such a reappearance. However, it is true that theologians have been experimenting with polygenism nonetheless. In an article published in 1970, while Paul VI was still Pope, Karl Rahner asserted that the Church's magisterium had by then come to tolerate the opinion of polygenism. I think that tolerate was the right word to use. Opinio tolerata is the lowest theological note, and in some cases the Church has taught one thing by her ordinary magisterium and tolerated another. Before the Immaculate Conception was infallibly defined, it was already the ordinary teaching of the Church, as is clear from the teaching of popes and the liturgy, while at the same time popes tolerated its denial among Dominicans, out of respect for Aquinas, who denied it. It seems to me that today the Church favours monogenism, yet permits discussion of polygenism, tolerates it, out of respect for dialogue between science and theology. In conclusion, I want to say that both monogenism and polygenism have their challenges. It seems to me that Pius XII's ordinary magisterium ruled out interpreting Adam as a population, and polygynists would be better to interpret Adam as the head of an original population. However, they face the challenge that population genetics thinks in terms of a much larger population than may be plausible for any polygenistic account of original sin. Likewise, there will have to be human beings not descended from Adam who receive original sin but are not descended from him. And as Pius XII said, it is not evident how this can be reconciled with the doctrine of original sin. In contrast, monogenists seem to have an easier task. If they distinguish between true humans, defined by the presence of a spiritual soul, and a wider breeding population of biologically defined humans, where having one parent with a spiritual soul is sufficient for getting one yourself. It seems to me that there are other issues facing both monogenists and polygynists, but I've done my best to present the framework which dogmatic theology holds out to them. Thank you very much for listening.